Once upon a time, in a land far away, there lived three villagers in a village. In fact, a really big civilization, not just a village, but a huge civilization. And these three people had some really, really special qualities, and we're going to talk about them today. Let's hear a story about these three interesting people in this civilization from long ago. The first was a constructor. He could construct anything: beautiful buildings, wonderful bridges, aqueducts, squares inside the center of cities, sidewalks, anything. He could construct many different types of buildings and towers and columns, all sorts of things. He was the best at what he did. He built things so strongly that all people admired him for his beautiful building. Now, as he got older, there was a great worry as to who would build and where his skills would go when he was no longer alive. He was such a great builder, certainly no one else would ever have his powers. In fact, his work was so noble that even the gods high on Mount Olympus took notice of the remarkable things that he had done. And they wondered what might happen once he was gone. Finally, even the great god Zeus took notice, and he had to think of what would become of this distinguished builder and constructor. But the constructor did not accomplish everything on his own. He had a partner, and this partner was a measurer, really good at measuring things perfectly and accurately. In fact, he was such a great measurer, the villagers and the gods took notice. Because building and measuring are very closely related, these two had to work together, the constructor and the measurer. Now this measurer was able to measure more accurately and more perfectly than any other person. His measurements were precise and absolutely perfect. Because of this, the constructor and the measurer were partners and worked together on many things. The measurer was able to measure things so exactly and so precisely that he was admired all throughout the civilization. And even the gods in Mount Olympus took notice. Now, as he got older, there was a great worry as to who would measure and where his skills would go when he was no longer alive. His appraising was so ideal, certainly no one else would ever have his powers. The gods and even Zeus took notice of all the remarkable things he had done and gave thought to what would happen to this most distinguished measurer. Well, would you be surprised to know that there was a third party? And she was a calculator. She could calculate anything in her head, anything at all. She didn't even need to use her fingers or a piece of paper, and she had all sorts of patterns of math and calculations in her head, and she was such a great calculator that the village took notice and the civilization took notice. And she also worked with the measurer and the constructor to create beautiful designs of architecture and buildings. The calculator could compute the exact value of things so accurately that all people admired her for her magnificent thinking. And now as she got older, there was a great worry as to who would calculate and where her skills would go when she was no longer alive. Her evaluations were so ideal, certainly no one else would ever have her powers. Now, her work was so noble that even the gods up high on Mount Olympus started to take notice and worried what would happen if she were gone. And even the great god Zeus had to put some thought into what would happen. And so these three humans, the constructor, the measurer, and the calculator, continued through life as three closely knit partners. They shared so many projects that even the gods high on Mount Olympus took notice of the great things they'd done and wondered what might happen if their alliance when they were gone. Finally, even the great god Zeus took interest and gave thought to what would become of these three and their grand partnership. Finally, the great god Zeus made a decision. He decided that we could not lose these remarkable people forever. We had to come up with a plan to preserve their distinguished work forever. And finally, he came up with a plan. So first he turned to the constructor and he said, I will make you a triangle. And then we can use you and use your triangle to construct all figures. It's true. Every figure we build can be built out of triangles, and it is. You can even imagine teeny tiny triangles building up into a circle. The triangle, the great constructor, constructs all figures, and it gives strength to so many figures. And triangles are still with us today. Even here today, the constructor is immortal. Now, Zeus turned to the measurer, and very carefully and very quickly, with one gentle stroke, turned the measurer into a square. And now he said, we as humans are granted the power to precisely measure any surface with this square. The square, the great measure, is also now immortal. It's true, squares are still with us, even here today. Immortal. Finally, the great god Zeus looked down upon the calculator, the great and wonderful calculator, and with a single stroke, the calculator was instantly and permanently transformed into a perfect circle. It's true, a circle can calculate all of the hidden angles, and it can measure and calculate all of the measurements of all things. The magnificent circle became the third ultimate and everlasting figure. The circle, the great calculator, is also now immortal. It's true. Circles in all their perfection are still with us, even here today, immortal. The circle is also a universal symbol of wholeness, perfection, eternity, and the infinite. With this circle, we're also pointed towards infinity, pointed towards eternity. So, the calculator creates and completes our triad of these wonderful shapes that still live on today. We have the constructor, the triangle, the measurer, the square, and the calculator, the circle. And indeed, these shapes still live on today. They are immortal. Now, these three live on forever. And we can imagine that they once were changed from three very interesting people into these three shapes, the triangle, the square, and the circle. You see, that was just the beginning. These three figures still live on, and as far as we know, they will live forever.